She was one of the wealthiest women in America. Her 3 children grew up wishing she was someone else's mother. She was born into the richest dynasty in the country and spent 20 years hiding her name. She built monuments for strangers and was rarely home for her own children. She fought a court battle to keep a child who was not hers, while 3 who were never entirely understood what she wanted from them. What does it cost a child to grow up in the shadow of a mother who was, by every account, extraordinary? Her name is on the wall of one of the most important museums in the United States. Her name is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. And she was, in every direction you look at her life, remarkable as a sculptor, as a patron, as a fighter. The question this story asks is a quieter one. What was she as a mother? 3 things this video will tell you that you will not find in the museum catalogue. Her oldest daughter fell in love with a man who would be dead within 2 years of the day she said yes. She saved every letter he sent her. She never spoke of him to her own children. Her son would marry 4 times. His father had stayed married once. The results, for both men, were similar. And the child Gertrude fought hardest for in court was not one of her 3. This is not a story about what Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney built. This is a story about what building it required. There is a name on that museum wall. By the end of this, you will know what it cost to put it there. The Vanderbilt money did not come from subtlety. Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, Gertrude's great-grandfather, had built his fortune from steamships and railroads, and he had done it with the specific brutality of a man who understood that the 19th century rewarded size and speed above everything else. By the time he died in 1877, he had accumulated $100 million, the equivalent of roughly 1/3 of the entire United States Treasury Reserve at the time. His descendants could not spend it down if they tried, though several of them spent the following decades attempting it. Gertrude Vanderbilt was born on the 9th of January, 1875, the second daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II and Alice Claypool Gwynn. Her older sister had died before Gertrude was born. She grew up with several brothers and a younger sister in a family home at 742 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan that occupied most of a city block, 130 rooms, 5 stories, the largest private residence in New York City. Summers were spent at the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. This requires some clarification. The Breakers is not a house in any ordinary sense of the word. It is a 70-room mansion modelled on 16th-century Italian Renaissance palaces, with a great hall rising 45 feet to a painted ceiling, a dining room that seated 36, and a children's wing separated from the adults' quarters by 3 flights of stairs and a corridor that, on a foggy evening, a 10-year-old might navigate only by memory. When Gertrude married Harry Payne Whitney in 1896, the combined wealth of the 2 families was estimated at figures that no newspaper would print in full for fear of seeming implausible. Harry's grandfather had co-founded the Standard Oil Trust with John D. Rockefeller. Gertrude's great-grandfather had built the railroads that moved American commerce for half a century. She was 21 years old. She had grown up in rooms designed to announce power. She had never, in her entire life, been asked what she wanted. The marriage to Harry Payne Whitney, celebrated at the Breakers in Newport in 1896, was, by every social measure, an event. 2 dynasties joined at the altar. The newspapers covered it with the gravity normally reserved for diplomatic agreements. The guest list was, in effect, a census of American Gilded Age power. Harry was charming, athletic, wealthy, and entirely indifferent to art. Gertrude knew this before she married him. She married him anyway. The options available to a Vanderbilt daughter in 1896 were not extensive. 3 children arrived in the first 6 years. Flora Payne Whitney in 1897, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Whitney called Sonny from the beginning in 1899, and Barbara Whitney in 1903. 3 children in a house run by staff, managed by schedule, ordered by season. Manhattan in the winter, Newport in the summer, Aiken in the spring. Gertrude loved her children. The evidence for this is not in doubt. What the evidence also shows clearly is that she loved something else more. She had kept drawings in her personal journals since childhood. Small watercolors, pencil sketches, studies of hands and faces. After her marriage, she began studying seriously. She attended the Art Students League in New York, studying under Hendrik Christian Andersen and James Earl Fraser. She traveled to Paris, to the emerging world of Montmartre and Montparnasse, and in Paris, she entered the studio of one of the most important sculptors alive. Auguste Rodin reviewed her work. Why would the richest woman in New York need to hide her name to be taken seriously? Because she was precisely the richest woman in New York. And in 1901, when Gertrude's first public commission appeared at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, a life-size male nude in plaster, titled Aspiration, the name on the catalogue was not hers. She worked under an assumed name. For years. She knew that if her work appeared under the Vanderbilt name, critics would dismiss it as socialite dabbling. She knew that if she accepted payment, other artists would call her a market distorter. She was trapped between her wealth and her seriousness, and she chose the only available path. She removed the name and let the work stand alone. Harry was not asked for his opinion on this arrangement. He had already made his position clear. Never expect Harry to take your work seriously. It never has made any difference to him that I feel as I do about art, and it never will, except as a source of annoyance. She said this to an artist friend, not in public, not in a letter meant for archives. It was recorded because the friend recorded it. It is the most honest sentence she ever uttered about her marriage. By 1910, she was exhibiting under her own name. By 1911, Spanish Peasant was accepted at the Paris Salon. By 1915, the Aztec Fountain won a bronze medal in San Francisco. By 1916, she held her first solo show in New York City. She had, in other words, done the thing that almost no woman of her social position had ever done. She had built a reputation on merit rather than name, then reclaimed the name once the merit was established. She had 3 children at home. She had a husband who found her art a source of annoyance. She had a family fortune so large, it made everything she built look like a hobby to anyone who wasn't paying attention. She was paying attention. And in 1907, she took a studio in Greenwich Village. She did not discuss this with Harry. She did not ask his opinion. She established an apartment and a workspace in the part of New York City that was as far from Fifth Avenue and Newport as geography could manage within the same island, and she went there to work. For 17 years, she had 2 lives. The 3 children grew up in the spaces between Gertrude's 2 lives. Flora, the eldest, born 1897, the year after the wedding, was, by all accounts, a girl of considerable intelligence and warmth. She made her debut in Newport in 1916. Gertrude was present, gracious, correct. She gave a party. She wrote Flora a warning beforehand, a note about comportment and reserve, that in its precise balance between maternal care and formal distance, tells you almost everything you need to know about how Gertrude understood her role as a mother. "Be very careful with the boys," she wrote. "You are older now and you must not be the least immodest or familiar. Don't ever let them touch you even jokingly." This is not the letter of an absent mother. It is the letter of a mother who was present in exactly the ways the social protocol of 1916 required and absent in most of the ways a 19-year-old girl actually needed. Sonny, born 1899, was the heir, the only son, the one who would carry both names forward. He graduated from Yale and went to work. He had his father's restlessness and his mother's ambition, distributed unevenly. Barbara, born 1903, was the quietest of the 3. The historical record is thinnest for Barbara. She appears at family events, in photographs, in formal listings of the Whitney children. She married once, in 1960, at the age of 57. In 1915, Gertrude's brother, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, went down with the Lusitania. The family absorbed the loss the way Vanderbilts absorbed most things, in silence, in structure, in the continuation of schedule. That same year, at a Newport debut party, Flora Payne Whitney met a young man named Quentin Roosevelt. Harry Payne Whitney was by reputation one of the most impressive men in America. His wife knew a different version. Quentin Roosevelt was 20 years old. He was the youngest son of President Theodore Roosevelt. He was, by every account of people who knew him, the kind of person who made other people feel more alive simply by being in the room. Flora noted in her diary that fall, it has happened. She was 19. He was 20. The war in Europe was already 2 years old, and the United States had not yet entered it. Within 2 years that would change. And within 2 years of Flora writing those 3 words, Quentin Roosevelt would be dead. In the summer of 1918, there was a piece of news that reached Gertrude at her hospital in France. She read it, she put it down, she went back to work. The summer of 1915 was the second year of the war in Europe, and America had not yet entered it. Flora Whitney was 17. She attended her coming-out party at Newport in a simple white satin dress with silver trim. She stood beside her mother at the entrance and greeted their guests. Among the hundreds of people who passed through that evening was a young man named Quentin Roosevelt, 18 years old, youngest son of former President Theodore Roosevelt, known in every room he entered for the specific quality of making other people feel more alive, simply by being present. He wrote Gertrude a thank you note afterward, describing the party as leaving him with a kaleidoscopic impression, accompanied by a pleasant, subdued tinkle, as of ice against the sides of a cocktail shaker. He wrote separately to her father to say he was sorry he had forgotten his comb. He was exactly the kind of person who wrote notes like that. For the next year he called on Flora regularly. Letters, calling cards, postcards. A chaste Valentine. A Harvard sophomore sending correspondence to a Newport debutante, with the formality the era required on the outside and, in the actual words, something considerably warmer. By the fall of 1916, Flora had a name for what had happened. She wrote it in her diary. Not a long entry, 3 words and a great many exclamation marks. It has happened. Then she took her mother for a drive and told her. Gertrude's response to the news that her eldest daughter had fallen in love is not recorded in detail. What is recorded is what Gertrude had already written to Flora the year before in the letter about comportment. Be very careful with the boys. Don't ever let them touch you even jokingly. She had warned her daughter to maintain reserve. She had given her protocol. She had not given her a vocabulary for what to do when someone like Quentin Roosevelt wrote you letters that sounded like that. Quentin told his father exactly what was missing from the Whitney house. He put it in a letter. His father kept it. In September 1917, after the United States had entered the war and Quentin had crossed to France as a fighter pilot, he wrote to Flora with a formal proposal. If I'm in the spring offensive, I ought to have a long leave by the end of next summer, and if I do, will you marry me then? This is the first real proposal I've made to you, and please don't say no. She did not say no. While her daughter was falling in love with a fighter pilot in Newport, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was in France. Not as a tourist, not on a social visit. She had personally financed the construction and staffing of a 225-bed hospital in Juilly, in the Seine-et-Marne region northeast of Paris, built inside a wing of the Jesuit College of Juilly, close enough to the front lines that the distinction between hospital and battlefield was sometimes a matter of which way the wind was blowing. She funded it herself. She administered it herself. She made several trips to France during the war, arriving with medical supplies, working through the logistics of a functioning field hospital, while most women of her social position were organizing benefit dinners in Manhattan. She kept journals during every visit. The Smithsonian now holds those journals. They are available online, fully transcribed by volunteers, 184 pages of observations from a woman who spent her Gilded Age fortune on other people's wounded sons. In the same months that Gertrude was travelling between Julie and Paris, sketching injured soldiers and writing in her hospital journals, Harry Payne Whitney was at Foshley, his 14,000-acre quail hunting plantation in northern Florida, or at his horse farm in Lexington, Kentucky, where he was developing the American polo pony by breeding quarter-horse stallions with thoroughbred mares, or on the polo field near Saratoga, where the field still bears his name today. He was, in the assessment of at least one historian who examined their marriage in detail, a man who had virtually nothing in common with his wife, and they led mostly separate lives. This is not a secret buried in an archive. It is the observable record of two people who married in 1896 because their families were both at the top and produced 3 children together, and then conducted their lives in parallel, in the same houses, without ever particularly closing the gap. Harry was charming and athletic and socially effortless, and entirely present in every room he entered, and entirely absent from every interior landscape his wife occupied. Gertrude had written it herself. "It never has made any difference to him that I feel as I do about art, and it never will." She stopped expecting it to be different sometime before 1907, which is when she opened the Greenwich Village studio and began conducting her real life in a location he did not visit. I told you Flora saved every letter. This requires some specificity about what that means. Quentin Roosevelt was, by every account, a prolific correspondent. His father had instructed him explicitly, write her letters, interesting letters, and love letters, at least 3 times a week. Write, no matter how tired you are, no matter how inconvenient it is. Write if you're smashed up in a hospital. Write when you are doing your most dangerous stunts. Write all the time. He did. On the 11th of July 1918, 3 days before Bastille Day, Quentin wrote to Flora from an airfield in France. He told her he thought he had gotten his first German plane. He was 20 years old. He was proud. He was alive. 3 days later, on the 14th of July, 1918, Bastille Day Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt took off with his squadron in the 95th Aero Squadron over the Château Thierry sector. Accounts vary slightly on how it happened, but what is known is this. He was separated from the group, and when he was separated, he was isolated. His Newport 28C1 was shot down. When the German soldiers reached the wreckage, they found papers in the cockpit. They were Flora's letters. He had been carrying them. When the Germans confirmed who the American casualty was, the son of the former President of the United States, they buried him in a dignified, well-marked grave. The grave became a visited site almost immediately. Back in the United States, at Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt received a telegram with a gap in it where the censors had blocked the name. He did the arithmetic in his head. He ruled out the older sons. Ted was wounded and recovering. Archie was also wounded. Kermit had malaria. That left 1. Quentin's death was confirmed publicly on July 20. Theodore Roosevelt issued a statement. He made his public appearances. He corresponded. He continued. He died 6 months later, on the 6th of January, 1919, of a coronary embolism. He was 60. His physician said that grief had accelerated everything. Flora Payne Whitney kept every letter Quentin Roosevelt had ever written to her. She never spoke of him to her own children. She married twice after his death. She had a family. She ran the Whitney Museum for years after her mother's death. She attended Flora's own children's debuts and her grandchildren's, and she floated into rooms with what her granddaughter later described as expectant delight and curiosity. She was 20 years old on the 14th of July, 1918. She kept the letters until she died in 1986. She was the only one who ever read them. News reaching Gertrude in France, she went back to work. I told you there was a piece of news that reached Gertrude at her hospital in France. There were, in fact, several. The war produced news at a volume that made individual items difficult to process. Gertrude's hospital in Julie received the casualties that came off the front lines. She had been sketching them for 3 years by the summer of 1918. The men who arrived from the Marne, from the Somme, from the sectors that became names only after everything that happened in them. On the 14th of July, 1918, she received the news about Quentin, her eldest daughter's fiancé, the young man who had written the thank you note about the cocktail shaker and the forgotten comb, the boy who had sent Flora letters she was saving in a box somewhere in New York. What Gertrude wrote about this in her hospital journal is not what you might expect. She wrote about the hospital, she wrote about the patients, she wrote about the supplies and the administrative problems and what she had observed that day in the wards. She went back to work. This is not coldness. This is the only honest description of who Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was in a crisis. She organized, she administered, she produced, and she processed grief in a register that was not available to anyone watching from the outside. After Quentin died, Flora became a surrogate Roosevelt. The actual Roosevelts noticed what her own family had not provided. Her daughter was in New York with a box of letters and no fiancé, and the specific kind of grief that belongs to 20-year-olds who have only just understood what it means to lose someone they expected to have forever. Gertrude was in France. She came home when the war ended. Harry Payne Whitney died in 1930. He left Gertrude something she had not expected, not in the will, but in the aftermath. Flora recovered, the way young women in 1919 were expected to recover. She went to parties. She appeared at events. She smiled in photographs and wore appropriate dresses. And eventually, because the alternative was not acceptable, she rebuilt. Sonny, 20 years old himself in 1919, came back from his own wartime experience and began moving through the Gilded Age social world, his family occupied. He had his father's facility for rooms, his mother's restlessness, and neither parent's ability to remain in a single arrangement for very long. Barbara, 16 in 1919, was the quietest. She watched her sister and her brother and her mother and her father, and the historical record shows very little of what she concluded from what she saw. And Gertrude came home from France. She went back to her studio in Greenwich Village. She went back to the second life she had been living since 1907. And in 1919, she began work on the sculpture that would define her public reputation and cost her, privately, more than anything else she ever built. I told you Harry Payne Whitney had a version his wife never got to see. Here is what the public record shows. On the 26th of October, 1930, Harry Payne Whitney died at his home at 871 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, pneumonia. He had been ill for only a few days. He was 58 years old. The newspapers covered it the way they covered everything about Harry Whitney, extensively, admiringly, and with the particular warmth reserved for men who are rich, athletic, and dead before anything complicated can emerge. The New York Times described him as a sportsman and financier. The racing world noted the end of the man who had built the dominant stable in American thoroughbred history. The polo world acknowledged a 10-goal player, the highest ranking possible, who had essentially invented the modern American polo pony. The New York State tax authorities, working with somewhat less sentiment, appraised his estate at $62,808,000. In his will, he left specific bequests of more than $5 million to his 3 children. The remainder was placed in trust. Now, here is what the estate record does not show. Harry Whitney had spent the last 23 years of his marriage to one of the most artistically significant women of her generation, largely indifferent to that fact. He had watched her build a studio in Greenwich Village, establish a field hospital in France, develop a collection of nearly 700 works of American art, and cultivate relationships with the most important artists working in the United States during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And he had done all of this watching from a very comfortable distance, with the specific disengagement of a man who found his wife's seriousness a source of annoyance. He was not cruel. The record does not show cruelty. What it shows is something that in many ways produces the same result. He was simply elsewhere. At Fauchery, at Saratoga, at the Polo Grounds, at Yale reunions, at his club. Gertrude was at her studio, at her hospital, at her collection, at the Whitney Studio Club on West 8th Street, where since 1918 she had been running a free gallery for living American artists who could not get their work into the established institutions. They occupied the same houses for 34 years. They produced 3 children. And then, on the 26th of October, 1930, Harry Whitney died in his bed on Fifth Avenue. And for the first time since her wedding day in Newport in 1896, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was alone. She was 55 years old. She had been building something for 25 years that required one final decision to become permanent. With Harry gone, she made it. I told you Quentin Roosevelt had written something to his father that the Whitney family never published. Here is what it said. At some point during his relationship with Flora, the precise date is unclear, but it is documented in multiple sources. Quentin wrote to Theodore Roosevelt about the Whitney household. He was trying to explain to his father what made Flora different from other girls he had known, and in doing so, he said something that, if anyone in the Whitney family had read it, would have explained a great deal about what the 3 children never quite said out loud. He told his father that what he valued about Flora was all the family life, all the things that you have taught us, and then he added the part that mattered, which don't exist with her father and mother. Theodore Roosevelt was a man who ran with his children, who wrote them letters, who took them camping, who turned the White House into a place where a 10-year-old could roller skate in the hall. He understood immediately what his son was describing. Flora Whitney had grown up in a 70-room mansion with a staff of dozens, a mother who had a second life she was only partly told about, and a father who found her mother's interior world a source of annoyance. She had been warned about boys by letter. She had received comportment, not warmth. What she had found in Quentin Roosevelt was the thing her own house had not provided. He died on Bastille Day, 1918, carrying her letters in his cockpit. She never spoke of him to her children. I told you Harry Payne Whitney left behind something Gertrude had not expected. It was not in the will. What Harry left, by dying, was the absence of the one person whose chronic indifference had functioned for 34 years as a kind of low-grade friction on everything Gertrude tried to build. He had never actively stopped her. He had simply never particularly cared. And there is a version of marriage in which the lack of caring, compounded over decades, produces its own form of obstruction. In 1929, the year before Harry died, Gertrude had made a decision. She had been collecting American art for 25 years. She had approximately 700 works, paintings, sculptures, drawings, by American artists who had struggled during those decades. For any institutional recognition in a country that still treated European art as the default standard of seriousness, she wanted to give the collection a permanent home. She approached the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She offered them nearly 700 works. She offered them the funding to construct a dedicated building to display the works. She offered, in other words, to solve the problem of American art's institutional invisibility at her own expense, in one of the most significant gifts any private collector had ever proposed to a major museum. The Metropolitan Museum said no. The reasons, such as they were, reduced to this: the Metropolitan did not consider the collection significant enough to warrant a dedicated space. American art, in 1929, was still not a category the institution took with full seriousness. The richest woman in New York had just offered them 700 paintings and the money to house them. They said no. I told you Gertrude had been living a second life for 17 years in the studio on West 8th Street in Greenwich Village, in the Whitney Studio Club on the same block, in the Paris apartment in Passy, in the spaces where her real work happened, while Harry went to the polo grounds. Harry had never asked about any of it. Now Harry was dead, the Metropolitan had declined, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney had 700 works of American art and a clear answer about where they needed to go. On the 17th of November, 1931, 13 months after Harry's death, the Whitney Museum of American Art opened at 812 West 8th Street in Greenwich Village. The location was not accidental. It was built around the studio and gallery spaces she had been operating since 1907. The museum that bore her name was built on the same ground where she had worked for 24 years, under conditions her husband had found annoying. The opening statement she gave was brief. She had been collecting American art for 25 years, she said, not only because she thought it worthwhile, but because she believed in American creative talent. She did not mention Harry. There was nothing to mention. 3 years after the Whitney Museum opened, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney walked into a New York courtroom and fought the most public legal battle of her life. The child at the center of it was not one of her 3. Her brother, Reginald Vanderbilt, had died in 1925, at 45 years old, of cirrhosis of the liver. He had inherited $7.5 million at 21 and spent it methodically. By the time he died, the money was gone. What remained was a trust fund, and what remained of the trust fund would not be accessible until his daughter reached adulthood. The daughter was Gloria Laura Vanderbilt. She was 18 months old when her father died. Her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was awarded $4,000 a month from the court to maintain a home for the child. With the allowance, she traveled. Paris, London, Cannes, Hollywood, Monte Carlo, Biarritz, Switzerland. She crossed the Atlantic as often as once a month. Her twin sister was the mistress of the Prince of Wales. Her own social calendar was arranged around a world that had no particular space for a small child. For almost a decade, little Gloria sometimes did not see her mother for months at a time. In June of 1932, little Gloria's tonsils were removed in New York. Gertrude Whitney suggested that the 8-year-old recuperate over the summer at the Whitney estate in Old Westbury, Long Island. The mother agreed. That fall, the Whitney family doctor recommended she remain. The mother agreed again. Surrogate Judge Foley, informed that the child was now living with her aunt, reduced the mother's allowance from $48,000 to $9,000 a year. The mother stopped agreeing. In September, little Gloria was brought to New York City to visit her mother. The mother announced that she was not going back to the Whitney house. The following morning, while Gertrude, Aunt Consuelo, and Gloria Morgan sat together in the Whitney mansion drinking sherry, little Gloria was quietly taken out to a car by nurse Emma Keislich and Gertrude's private maid. When her mother asked where her daughter was, Gertrude looked at her and said, "Little Gloria is halfway to Westbury by now. I'm not going to let you have her." Court papers arrived that afternoon. The trial opened on the 1st of October 1934, in the matter of Vanderbilt. More than 100 reporters were present. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. It was, in the middle of the Great Depression, the most expensive and most closely watched domestic dispute in American legal history. 2 women, from one of the country's founding dynasties, fighting over a 10-year-old girl, while the country read every word. Nurse Emma Keislich took the stand and described Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt as a lazy, loose, erotic woman who was indifferent to rats and vermin that swarmed in her house and cruel to her child. Her testimony lasted 5 hours. A chauffeur testified about Mrs. Vanderbilt's lovers. A French maid testified that she had found a woman of considerable social standing at Mrs. Vanderbilt's bedside, kissing her just like a lover. Judge Carew closed the courtroom to press and public. The testimony against Gertrude was of a different order. Opposing counsel attempted to establish that her interest in the nude figure as a sculptor, as a collector, as the founder of a museum that displayed modern American art, constituted an immoral influence on a 10-year-old child. The judge, having heard 5 weeks of testimony, took little Gloria into his chambers. He asked her simple questions. The stenographer recorded her answers. How would you like to live with your mother? No, never. I always want to live with my aunt. You have lived a long while with your mother? Yes, but I have hardly seen her. She has never been nice to me. Don't you think you could learn to love her? No. She never even kissed me good night. On the 21st of November, 1934, Judge Carew awarded school year custody to Gertrude. The mother received Saturday morning to Sunday evening each week, 8 hours on Christmas Day, and the entire month of July. The newspapers printed a rhyme. New York Journal American. Rockabye baby up on a writ, Monday to Friday, mother's unfit. Little Gloria moved into the old Westbury estate on a permanent basis. The guards remained posted around the house. Nurse Keislich, the woman who had not missed a day or night with the child since 2 weeks after her birth, was dismissed by the judge's order. On Saturday mornings, under guard, little Gloria travelled to her mother's suite at the Sherry Netherland Hotel in Manhattan, where reporters stood alongside detectives and spectators who shouted questions as she walked through the entrance. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, having won the most public custody battle in American legal history, returned to her work. What the record shows, documented, sourced, stated plainly in the legal archive, is that she lost interest in little Gloria almost immediately after the trial ended. The child who had told a judge she always wanted to live with her aunt found, in the weeks and months that followed the verdict, that the aunt who had fought for her in open court had essentially no further use for her now that the fight was over. Little Gloria grew up in the Whitney house after the trial. She described what that felt like in her own memoir. The description is one sentence. Sonny Whitney married 4 times. His father managed once. By 1935, it was already clear which parent's pattern he had inherited and which one. When Gertrude died in 1942, she left the museum something it had never had before. It was not a painting, it was not a building. It was the only thing the museum needed to survive the next decade. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney died on the 18th of April, 1942. She was 67 years old. She left behind a museum. She left behind a collection. She left behind 3 children who had grown up in the spaces between her 2 lives, the one she showed Newport and the one she kept in Greenwich Village. She left behind a niece who, by the terms of a judge's ruling, had been given to her. And she left behind a question that none of the obituaries asked. What did the 3 who were actually hers think of all of it? Flora Payne Whitney was 20 years old in the summer of 1918. By January of 1919, she had lost 2 people. The first was Quentin Roosevelt, on Bastille Day. The second was Theodore Roosevelt himself, the man who had written his son those letters, who had told him to write Flora, no matter how tired he was, no matter how inconvenient, even if he was smashed up in a hospital. Theodore Roosevelt died on the 6th of January 1919, 6 months after Quentin. His physician said the grief had accelerated everything. In the weeks just before Theodore died, Flora had been working as his personal transcriber. She had, in other words, spent the last months of her fiancé's father's life sitting in the same room as the man who had told his son to love her out loud, in writing, 3 times a week. No matter what. And she had done this because it was the closest thing available to being near Quentin. After Theodore's death, she moved to Washington. She stayed with Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore's eldest daughter, famously sharp, famously unsentimental, the kind of woman who did not offer comfort so much as momentum. Flora worked briefly for the Women's Republican Committee and attempted to keep pace with Longworth's social life. What she was doing, if you look at the pattern of it, was locating herself as close to the Roosevelt family as proximity allowed. Quentin had told his father that what was missing from the Whitney house was the thing the Roosevelts had in abundance. Flora had found it. And when she lost Quentin, she did not go back to the house that had never had it. she stayed where it was. In 1920, Flora married for the first time. His name was Roderick Tower. He was a stockbroker. He was socially correct. He was, in the record, the son of the former United States ambassador to Germany and Russia. And he was a pilot who had trained with Quentin Roosevelt at Mineola Airfield on Long Island. This is not a coincidence, you can read neutrally. Flora Payne Whitney, in 1920, having lost the man she had planned to marry, chose a man who had trained alongside him, who had learned to fly in the same sky, at the same field, on the same island, in the same years. She married someone who had known Quentin not by design, perhaps, but not by accident either. The marriage failed within 5 years. Tower drank. Tower was unfaithful. By August 1925, they were divorced. 2 children, Pamela, born 1921, and Whitney, born 1923. Flora spent the summer of 1925 inches, Paris, with her mother. She began sculpting. In 1927, she married again. His name was George McCulloch Miller III. Cully, everyone called him an artist and businessman. The wedding was in Cairo. The marriage lasted 45 years, until Cully died in 1972. They had 2 more children together. The second marriage was the real one. Flora Miller Biddle, Flora's daughter, later described her parents as frequently absent in the early years, actively seeking pleasure, fun, the good life, leaving their children to a strict nanny. The pattern had moved 1 generation forward, but the shape of it remained recognizable. When Gertrude died in 1942, Flora took over the Whitney Museum. Her daughter said of that moment, "Her longing and then her mourning poured into the museum, enriching it for more than 25 years." She had not been able to talk to her mother. She had said so herself, in a letter at 18. "I admire and respect and of course adore Mama, but there is no companionship at all." After Gertrude died, Flora found a way to finally close the distance. She ran the institution her mother had built for 25 years, until 1966. She was the best director the museum ever had, by most accounts. She gave her mother what she had not been able to give her in life, her complete attention. I told you Sonny Whitney had married 4 times. The question I planted was which parent's pattern he had inherited. Here is the answer, and it is not the one you expect. His father, Harry Payne Whitney, had married once. He had stayed married for 34 years, until he died of pneumonia, at 58, in his own bed, at 871 Fifth Avenue. In every outward sense, Harry Whitney was a man of constancy. Same wife, same clubs, same horses, same polo fields, same season in Newport. The constancy, as the record shows, masked a particular kind of absence, but the form of it was singular. Sonny married 4 times. Marie Norton, 1923, divorced 1929. Gladys Crosby Hopkins, 1931, divorced 1940. Eleanor Searle, 1941, divorced 1957. Marie Louise Schroeder, 1958. This one lasted until Sonny died in 1992, at 93 years old, in Saratoga Springs. The pattern Sonny had inherited was not his father's. Harry Whitney had stayed in one marriage and been elsewhere inside it. Sonny moved through 4 marriages and was, by all accounts, fully present in each of them while it lasted. He co-founded Pan American World Airways in 1927, at 28 years old. He funded the Technicolor Corporation. He was a financial backer of Gone with the Wind in 1939. He produced The Searchers in 1956, John Ford, John Wayne, the film that many critics now consider the greatest American Western ever made. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force under Truman. He raised thoroughbred champions. He owned 51,000 acres in the Adirondacks. He was restless, ambitious, serious about the things he chose to be serious about, and constitutionally unable to remain in any single arrangement for very long. He was, in other words, his mother's son. He just ran the motor in a different direction. And then there was Barbara, born 1903, the youngest of the three, the one the historical record treats as a footnote. She appears in family photographs. She appears in the guest lists for Whitney Museum events. She appears, briefly, in the legal record of her parents' estate. She is mentioned in Gertrude's obituaries as a surviving daughter. She is almost never the subject of a sentence. She is almost always the object of one. What the record shows in full is this. Barbara Whitney had a first marriage that ended in divorce. The name of the husband does not survive with enough consistency to be stated here with confidence. She married Samuel Anderson Peck in 1947 in Oyster Bay, New York. Peck died in 1960. That same year, within months of his death, she married George William Headley III, an artist and jeweler, and a man who eventually founded a museum in Kentucky that still exists today. She died in 1982. 3 marriages, quiet ones, no foundations, no museums, no custody trials, no aviation ventures, no memoirs. She was the youngest child of one of the most accomplished women in the history of American art, and she spent her life in the margins of the institutional memory that woman left behind. In the part 1 of this story, I said Barbara married once. The record shows 3 times. I am correcting that here, where the full evidence arrived. There are no verified quotes from Barbara Whitney about her mother, not one. That absence is its own kind of answer. I told you Gertrude won the custody trial. I told you the child who had told a judge she always wanted to live with her aunt found, in the weeks and months after the verdict, that the aunt had essentially no further use for her. Here is what the record shows. After the 21st of November, 1934, little Gloria Vanderbilt moved permanently into the old Westbury estate. She attended school. She lived in the house. She was, by all legal definitions, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's ward during the school year. She was also, by the account that survives in the legal and personal record, ignored. The Encyclopedia.com article on the custody trial states it directly. Little Gloria now spent quiet weekdays in Old Westbury, ignored by her Aunt Gertrude. The same source states that Gertrude lost interest in her immediately after the trial. How do you explain this? How do you explain a woman who financed a 225-bed hospital in France at her own expense, who collected 700 works by living American artists who had nowhere else to go, who fought the most public domestic legal battle in American history to keep a child she believed was being neglected, and then, having won, essentially neglected the same child herself? There is no clean answer. The historical record does not provide one. What the record provides are the facts. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was, by every measure, an extraordinary producer of institutions. The hospital in Julie, the studio club on West 8th Street, the Whitney Museum, the custody arrangement. Every one of these things was built, structured, established, and then administered by people she appointed and trusted. She was a founder. She was not, by temperament or training, a daily presence. The Greenwich Village studio, the Paris apartment, the hospital journals, the sculpture. She organized things. She set them in motion. She moved to the next one. The child in the old Westbury house was not a sculpture. She was not a museum. She was not a hospital that could be staffed and administered by someone else. She required the specific daily attention that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney had never, in 60 years of living, been particularly designed to give. I told you Gloria Vanderbilt wrote a memoir. It was published in 1985, when she was 61 years old. She titled it, Once Upon a Time, A True Story. Alfred A. Knopf published it. It tells the story of her childhood through a child's eyes, the trial, the houses, the guards, the silence. The Encyclopedia.com review of that memoir, in the context of the custody trial records, describes the old Westbury years in terms that align precisely with the court documents. A child who was given a house and a verdict, and then left largely alone inside both. Gloria Vanderbilt went on to become one of the most recognizable names in American fashion, art, and culture. She had 4 sons. She survived losses that would have ended most people. She spoke of her aunt in interviews, over the years, with the particular measured tone people use when they have been working on a feeling for a very long time. The feeling was not warmth. I told you Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney left the museum something it had never had before. Not a painting, not a building. On the 18th of April, 1942, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney died at her home in New York City. Heart condition. She was 67 years old. The New York Times ran the obituary on the front page. She was described as sculptor, patron, founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art, heiress to 2 of the great Gilded Age fortunes, wife of Harry Payne Whitney, mother of 3, aunt of Gloria Vanderbilt. The obituary was accurate. It was also, like most obituaries, a description of what the subject had produced rather than what producing it had cost. Her will was filed on the 5th of May 1942. The New York Times covered the filing. The terms were precise. The Whitney Museum of American Art was cleared of every dollar of debt it owed to Gertrude, debt she had been carrying personally since the museum opened in 1931. And the museum was granted $2.5 million from her estate. For 11 years, she had been the museum's primary funder, its founding director's patron, and its operating backstop. She had carried it through the Depression. She had carried it through the first 2 years of the Second World War. She had done all of this while Harry Payne Whitney found her work a source of annoyance, while the Metropolitan Museum turned down her collection, while her daughter could not talk to her, while her son moved through marriages, while her youngest left no recorded opinion of any of it. What she left the museum was not a painting. It was financial freedom. For the first time since the 17th of November 1931, the institution that carried her name owed nothing to anyone. It could, finally, simply exist. I told you, at the beginning of this story, that there is a name on that museum wall. I told you I would tell you what it cost to put it there. Here is the accounting. Flora Payne Whitney grew up unable to talk to her mother. She said so herself. She found her warmth in a family that was not hers, married a man who had trained with the person she actually loved, ran her mother's museum for 25 years, and poured into the institution the grief she could not otherwise place. Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney Sonny built airlines and polo championships and film studios and horse farms across 4 marriages, in the restless, serious, productive pattern of a woman who could not stay in one place, and a man who never left his. Barbara Whitney married 3 times, left no recorded opinion of her mother, and died in 1,982 inches at the historical margin. And a child who was not Gertrude's, who told a judge she always wanted to live with her aunt, grew up in her house, ignored, and spent the next 50 years writing and speaking in the measured tone of someone who has been working on a feeling for a very long time. The name on the museum wall is Whitney. What it cost the 3 who grew up behind it was something the museum catalogue does not list. It was not painted, it was not sculpted, it is not on display, but it is there. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was born into a house of 130 rooms and spent her life building institutions large enough to contain everything she needed to say. She said it in bronze and in stone, and in the names of galleries, and in the wills of lawyers, and in hospital journals that volunteers transcribed a century later, line by line, for a digital archive. She said almost none of it to her children. Flora knew it. She wrote it in a letter at 18 and then spent 25 years running her mother's museum, which is perhaps the most eloquent response anyone has ever given to not being understood. Sonny knew it. He moved the way his mother moved forward, into the next project, the next venture, the next arrangement, because that was the only speed available in the house he grew up in. Barbara knew it. She chose silence, which is also a kind of answer. The museum is still open. It moved to the meatpacking district in 2015. It has Gertrude's name on the wall and her collection behind the walls and the $2.5 million from her will somewhere deep in the institutional memory of its balance sheet. Flora Miller Biddle, Flora's daughter, Gertrude's granddaughter, said that when her mother took over the museum after Gertrude's death, her longing and then her mourning poured into the museum. A grandmother the granddaughter never fully knew, a mother the daughter could not talk to, a museum neither of them built but both of them sustained. There is a name on that wall. Now you know what it cost.